So, I would be very happy to cover topics that you're interested in. In general, there are other topics. There's certain topics that I don't really want to deal with because they border on craziness. Let's put it that way, or whatever. I don't want to go. I don't want to go into it, but certainly this is a topic, the concept of Deveikut, that I'm very happy to discuss. What is Deveikut? First of all, Deveikut is the idea of cleaving to the Almighty. When you're done cleaving, can we look at Tanya? Yes, I have that planned. That's coming in the future. Did I cover the concept of Deveikut some time ago? It's very possible I did. I don't really remember. I give a lot of classes in different places, so it could be I gave one on the subject here. I don't know. I don't remember, but in any event, I'm sure that it's worth talking about again. Okay, so the concept of Deveikut is cleaving. Now, I would like to start off essentially at the beginning. Let's start off with some sort of historical analysis. Although Deveikut, the concept of Deveikut, when the soul cleaves to its root up above, and I'll explain what that means, or it cleaves to God. I'll explain what that all means later. Although Deveikut has always been a subject, since it's in fact one of the verses in the Torah, it's one of the verses in the Bible, in Scripture. In fact, there's more than one verse. There's several verses. You cleave to God, and therefore you are all alive today. Those who cleave to God are alive. That's in Deuteronomy 4:4. There's another verse in Deuteronomy, which is a commandment, cleave to Him, and we'll explain that a little bit later on. Another one also in Deuteronomy in 11:22, where it says to love the Lord your God and to go in His ways and to cleave to Him, and so on and so forth. And there's various in Psalms. There's also some explanations or expositions of this same idea. But let's begin at the beginning. Although Deveikut is a subject that is mentioned in the Torah in Scripture, as I just said, there is nevertheless a certain aspect of Deveikut that is not that well known. But let's begin at the beginning. The earliest Kabbalists, when they spoke about what is called essentially Avodat Hashem, divine service. I'm just looking now for, sorry, I should have got this up earlier, I forgot about it, but yeah, okay. Let me just share a screen over here for a minute. So the early Kabbalists, when they discussed the dynamics, or maybe dynamics is the wrong word, but the practical side of Kabbalah, it's called in modern terminology avodah, the work that you do, what you have to actually do. So when I discuss these dynamics and this, the work that you ought to do, or that you ought to do, that has to be done in order to achieve some kind of spiritual level. So the primary thing that they spoke about in earlier texts was the idea of Kavanot. Kavanot, K-A-V-A-N-O-T, Kavanot. Or in Hebrew, Chaf Vavav Nun Vav Taf, Kavanot. The concept of a kavanah it comes from the word which means to direct something. What was being directed? What is the direction that was being instituted? Well, what they were trying to do, and what they mostly achieved, was to be able to direct the flow of divine energy in a certain path. Now, what does that mean? Let me just, if you look at the drawing over here, the diagram of the 10 Sfirot, right, all the 10 Sfirot, this has the worlds in it as well, but I'll discuss that later. Let's say you want to bring down a an outflow from the Sphira of Chesed, the Sphira of Chesed. Chesed is the concept of kindness, the kindness of divine kindness or divine love, elicited and brought down from one level to another. Let's say what you want to focus on is bringing that energy or that light, the light of love, into lower levels. Or, all right, let's just first talk about in lower levels. So what you would do is you would mechavein, you would have the kavanah, the intentions of drawing down the light of chesed into, let's say, the channel between chesed and netzach. This is the channel between chesed and netzach, between those two sfirot, right? So you would elicit and bring down chesed down into netzach, right? By focusing on this particular channel. Each of these channels is associated with one of the letters. The Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Formation, very early work, which is attributed actually to Abraham, although he never wrote it down, but he taught it to his son and to his grandchildren and so on and so forth. Anyway, traditionally it comes from Abraham. The last Mishnah of the last teaching in the Sefer Yetzirah explains that this was all transmitted to Abraham by God, essentially, by God and the angels, transmitted these teachings to Abraham, and he passed them on. It was only written down, like much of the oral Torah. In fact, all of the oral Torah was never written down. It was only transmitted orally. It was never written down for specific reasons, but it was never written down. And it was only written down in the time of the, what they call the Tanaim. The Tanaim were these great, great sages from the time of the, essentially the 1st century, right after the destruction of the temple. The destruction of the second temple was in the year 70 in the modern calendar, in the year 70, and subsequent to that is when, or at that time is when the Mishnah started to be written down, because the sages realized that the Jewish people were going to go into exile, and they wouldn't always have their teachers with them, but if they had things written down, then they would still be able to study. So all the studies became, all the oral Torah began to be written in sort of rudimentary form, what's called the Mishnah form, which means just sort of pithy, very dense, very packed, short statements called Mishnah. And there are 6 orders of the Mishnah. And similarly, just as there were 6 orders of the Mishnah, so there were various orders of the secrets of the Torah, the mystical aspects that were also written down, but these were kept sort of under lock and key mostly. They were only transmitted from one sage to another when the sage felt that his student or colleague was ready for such a transmission. In any event, that was around that time also that the Zohar was actually composed by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. The first generations of Tanoim, I think he was a 2nd generation or 3rd generation Tana, and when he composed the Zohar, but the secret teachings, these teachings were handed down. So in Sefer Yetzirah, which was written down by, according to our tradition, by Rabbi Akiva, the famous sage Rabbi Akiva wrote it down, taught by Abraham, and passed down through the generations. He wrote it down. In any event, so they speak about the channels between the Sfirot, and that the channels between the Sfirot are associated with the Hebrew letters. Therefore, every channel has a letter associated with it. And then there are the Sfirot. So in order to be able to draw down the influence or the light, or whatever you want to call it, from one Sphira to another Sphira, from, let's say, the Sphira of Chesed, from the Sphira of Chesed to the Sphira of Netzach, so that had to be done by using this channel. Of course, it could be done by other channels as well. You could go this way. You could go sort of, let's see here. Oops. You could go this path as well. You could go from there to there and then from there to there. But that wasn't the ideal way of doing it. These PDFs are not the best way to do things. Okay, so in any event, there were channels, and each channel had a letter associated with it, and each channel had a meditation associated with it. Each sphera has a holy name associated with it. So, for example, the name that's associated with Chesed is the name Aleph Lamed Kel, as it's pronounced. We don't say the name unless we're actually using it in prayer. So we pronounce it as Kel, right? So the same, Shem Kel be Bechesed. Shem Elokim Begvura. That's the name Elokim would be in Gvura, and so on and so forth. And each Sphira was associated with a certain divine name. Now, these names are all the names of God, but they're the names of God in a certain type of activity, you could say, right? So when God is active in the aspect of loving kindness, so that would be the Sphira of Chesed, then it would be the Shem Kel that would be used. If it was more something like helping his children to win a war, so then it would be the Sphira of Gvura, right? Gvura, might. Which instills fear, and then it will be the name Elokim, and so on and so forth. Each sphera has its name, and one day maybe we'll actually go into all the names associated with them. But there were certain concepts also associated with certain meditations associated with drawing down the light from one sphera to another, or vertically, or could be horizontally as well. In other words, there could be a drawing down of energy from Chesed to Gvura in order to sweeten Gvura. Let's say that Gvura was in a state of, there was a state of severity and therefore fear in the world, right, and so on. So Chesed could be used to mamtik, to sweeten that Gvura. In other words, to sweeten it up a little bit, that it shouldn't be so harsh. It should be mitigated, it should be lessened, and so on. When there's too much chesed in the world, in other words, too much laxness about things, so sometimes it's necessary to make the channel go the other way, from gvura to chesed. Tighten things up a bit, bring in a little bit of judgment, bring in a little bit of the idea of restriction, and so on. Okay. So that was the early generation, and the whole system was brought into, am I missing people's comments maybe? I don't know. I'm not seeing, one second. Yeah, 1 second. Let me just see the chat. The chat has disappeared. Oh, here it is. Okay. Oh, there we go. Very nice, Paul. Thank you. All right. But I think this one's going to be a little bit different because it's going to be more extended, probably. We will see. 3 years ago. Okay. The whole system of Kavanot was really codified and put into a very clear order by Rabbi Moshe Cordovero in the work called the Paradise or Paradise Rimonim, a book that he wrote, which is sort of, you might say, probably the first systematic encyclopedia, I suppose you could call it, of Kabbalah. So that was the earliest system. Along came the Arizal, Rabbi Yitzhak Luria, and he focused on another aspect of things in addition to what there was before. Now, the way things work in Jewish thought and in Jewish development, Jewish history in general, you never tear down what was there previously and replace it. Generally, that's not the way that it's done, almost never. You build on what was there before. So the Arizal now built on this whole system of Kavanot by adding another dimension, which is called Yichudim. Yichudim means that there's not only a pathway between one sphera and another by which one elicits light from one sphera to travel to another one, and eventually to travel all the way down the system into Malchut, which is the sphera that kind of controls the world in which we live. But he brought about another thing, which is called a yichud, yichudim. Yichudim means unifications. Now, this is unifications between divine names. They sort of laced together so that one letter of one name, and then the first letter of one name, and then the second letter of the first letter of the second name, then the second letter of the first name, the second letter of the second name, and they brought together in a manner called shiluv. Let me just show you what a shiluv is. And I'll now use my very handy drawing board, which was a very generous gift from somebody. I didn't ask permission, I won't mention his name, but we know he knows who he is, and we know who he is. Okay, so let's say you have a letter, let's say you have a name with an Aleph, Gimel, Hey. Let's say, for example, right? Let's say there was such a name. There isn't such a name. I'm just using those letters, okay? And let's say you have a name, another name, which would be Beit, Daled, and Vav, right? Beit, Daled, and Vav. So how do you do the shiluv? So the shiluv would be like this. The shiluv would be you take the first letter of the first name, and then the second letter, the first letter rather of the second name, and then the second letter of the first name, the second letter of the, and so it would go on, right? And so it would go on until eventually you have a, this is a common concept. But anyway, this is called a shiluv, and this is shiluv of Shemot, right? So the Arizal used these things. He used these idea of what's called Yichudim to elicit a higher light, a light that transcends both of the names, right? Let's say that's a name of Chesed and that's a name of Gvura. So by joining the two of them together, you elicit a higher light from the next level up, which would be, in our case, let's go back to the screen, would be the Sphira of Da'at, right? Or perhaps it could be Bina, or it could be Chochmah, etc. Whatever, depending on what particular combination of names is done. Now, it's not only names that are important here, it could be a combination of concepts. It can also be a combination of actions, and we'll speak about this a little bit later. In any event, that was the system of the Arizal. So he built on top of the idea of Kavanot, he built on that the concept of Yichudim, which includes Kavanot and goes beyond them as well. Okay. Along came the Baal Shem Tov, and the Baal Shem Tov was fairly recent phenomenon, 1700 to 1760. Or 1698 to 1760, there's different opinions about that. But anyway, let's say the 1700s, around the 1700s. And the Baal Shem Tov emphasized this concept of Deveikut much more than had been emphasized previously. Now, what exactly is, how does this Deveikut work? Well, there are various texts which discuss this idea. There are various forms of Deveikut. One form of Deveikut, perhaps the simplest form of Deveikut, is through action, through the action of fulfilling the commandments, but fulfilling the commandments in a certain way, fulfilling the commandments with attachment to the commander of the commandments, i.e. to God, right? In other words, an attachment while one is doing the particular, fulfilling that particular commandment. Let's say it's lighting the candles for the Sabbath, or putting on tefillin, phylacteries, or doing some other, or giving charity, or something like that. One of the positive mitzvot, one of the positive commandments. So that would be a dveikut of a certain type. Right, it will be Deveikut of a certain type, Deveikut through action. That type of unification that's brought about as a result of that Deveikut is called a Deveikut of the Yesodot. In the human form, that would be called, that would parallel the idea of, how will we call it? I want to use terms which are not. Let's call it coupling. I don't know, I can't think of a better term right now, but it's the idea of a yichud of the yesodot. There's a male organ, a female organ. When they come together, that is a certain yichud. And by the way, sexual relationships in the Torah are regarded as holy, not as dirty or something to be despised or something to be, you just have to give in to them because it's human passion. No, they're regarded as many other human actions, like eating and drinking, etc., regarded as being in potential holy if they're done in a holy way. And they are also regarded as an analogy teaching us, which the analogy teaches how these things ought to be accomplished, how this particular Deveikut ought to be accomplished. And that's, by the way, the Song of Songs, Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, includes this idea of Deveikut, the Deveikut of the Yesodot, right? Then there's a higher level of Deveikut, which is called the Deveikut of the Zroot. Yemino techabkeni, his right arm embraces me. That is called the Deveikut, the cleaving of emotion to emotion. Cleaving in love, emotion to emotion. His right arm embraces me, so to speak. That right arm that embraces is the idea of the embracing of emotional qualities, not just embracing through action, which is which is the first form we spoke about, but the embracing through emotional attachment, emotional binding one to the other. That's that kind of Deveikut. And then the highest form of Deveikut is called the Deveikut of Neshikin, which in a literal translation would be kissing. Why? Because that's the highest part of the body, kissing in the mouth, in other words, which part of the head. So that's the Deveikut of the higher Sfirot. The Deveikut of kissing is the Deveikut of Torah and Tefillah, of Torah study of scripture and Torah teachings, and also prayer, right? Which are all done with the mouth. Teaching, studying the teachings is not something that's only done with the mind. It should be done out loud, which is why it is very common and very commendable for a person to learn, for people to learn in pairs. They learn in pairs, called a chavruta, and are very common. If you go into a yeshiva, a Jewish seminary, you'll see people are always learning, almost always learning in pairs. Why? Because the backwards and forwards and the discussion is what gives you clarity and what gives you memory and gives you understanding and so on and so forth. Okay, so that would be called the zivug neshikin, the zivug, the cleaving of kissing. Again, kissing is the head, and therefore it's the highest faculties, the faculty of, let me just share screen again. 1 second. Share screen. Okay, here we go. Yeah, so that would be the sharing of the intellectual properties of the soul. Zivug neshikin. Then there's a zivug of the midot, or the cleaving, the dveikut of the midot, of the emotional qualities, right, which is sort of the torso. And then there is the cleaving of the active qualities, the action, that would be the malchut, yesod, and essentially yesod and malchut, right? Let me just correct that. Yesod and malchut. Yesod, the male organ, malchut, the female organ, and that's the lowest level of yichud, the yichud of action, right? Appropriate for the world of Asiya. Okay, there also is another yichud which the Baal Shem Tov speaks about, and that's called the Yichud of Keter. The Yichud of Keter, which is essentially the Yichud of Emunah. Emunah meaning faith. means a bit more than faith. Faith in English doesn't really capture what the concept of emunah is. Emunah doesn't only mean faith, it means faithfulness, like the faithfulness of soul. That's what it's all about, the faithfulness of soul, so to speak. Okay, while we're here, let us now discuss what levels of soul are come into play in each of these types of levels, in each of these types of Deveikut. So here we see the various worlds. As you know, we've discussed the concept of worlds numerous times. In the worlds there are 5 worlds: the world of Adam Kadmon, the world of Atzilut, the world of Bria, the world of Yetzira, and finally the lowest world, the world of Asiya. Each of these have a level of consciousness associated with them. Adam Kadmon is complete God consciousness, right? Atzilut is what you might call purpose consciousness or unitary consciousness. Bria is intellectual consciousness. Yetzira, emotional consciousness. And Asiya, finally, physical consciousness, corresponding to the various soul levels. The soul levels are really levels of consciousness. Yechida corresponding to Adam Kadmon, God consciousness. Chaya corresponding to purpose and purpose consciousness, and Atzilut, Neshama, intellectual consciousness and consciousness and Bria, Ruach, emotional consciousness and Yetzira, Nefesh, physical consciousness, and Asiya. Now there could be another column over here, which I didn't add into this drawing, and maybe I should, would be the various sfirot associated with it. So as regards Yechida, that would be Keter. Chaya would be Chochma, Neshama Bina, Nishmat Kel Tavi name, it's the ending of Bina. Ruach is the idea of the 6 Sfirot, the 6 emotional qualities from Chesed to Yesod. And finally, Nefesh corresponds to Malchut, and that would be action, Malchut. So again, Keter, Chochma, Bina, Zeranpin, Malchut. Okay, so now, let us understand, therefore, what Deveikut is really essentially achieving. Even though the level of Nefesh, physical consciousness and corresponding to action, fulfillment of the mitzvot, is the lowest of all the levels, it nevertheless connects to the highest of all levels, as do they all, right? It can and definitely does connect to the highest level. Why? Because the commandments were not something that were man-made. They were divinely made. They were given to us. They weren't invented by us. They were given. And since they were given as divinely made commandments, the word for commandment, one of the words for commandment in Hebrew is actually the word tzavta, mitzvah, from the word tzavta. Tzavta means connection. The whole point of the mitzvot, of the commandments, is not just that they're commandments, they're connections, they're ways to connect. What do they connect with? Since they were given, they were divinely given, they connect the lowest level of soul with God consciousness, with the highest level, with essentially the highest level of soul, connecting essentially with God. That's basically the idea. The same thing is true of Ruach Deveikut, right? Emotional Deveikut, Deveikut through the emotions. They too reach up to a higher level, but primarily they filter through intellectual consciousness and purpose consciousness before they get to God consciousness. But it's possible to circumvent all the intermediary categories as well, when Ruach is also combined in the way of faith, in the way of Emunah. It's combined with Emunah, then it transcends, it just goes straight up to the source. Okay, similarly with intellectual consciousness and purpose consciousness and so on and so forth. So the concept therefore of Deveikut in the Baal Shem Tov's teachings is the concept of connecting. Now, when does one connect? Initially, the connection is through certain actions, certain ways of thinking, certain ways of understanding, certain emotional qualities, and so on. But the ultimate purpose is to come to a state of complete attached consciousness all the time. In other words, to be attached all the time. It says about, it says about the Rashbi, Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, the author of the Zohar, said about himself, with one knot, I am bound to him, to God. In other words, I don't have to go through all kinds of various knots, go up a ladder in order to achieve that connection. I'm connected all the time. He said this on the day of his passing, which it's a teaching that he had not revealed before. He spoke about his own personal levels that he was achieving or that he had achieved and so on. So he says over there that I am bound to the one above, like a b'chad katiri katana be'lahita be'achida be'lahita, one with him, and as a flame is bound to a coal, as the flame is bound to a coal. In other words, if the coal is not there, the flame is not there either, right? If the coal is there and the coal is alight, the flame is also there. Whether it's in the coal or outside of the coal is just a matter of what state it's in, but there's always fire. If the coal is alight, the fire is there. So that's the kind of Deveikut that he was speaking about. Now, one of the methods of Deveikut, another one of let me talk a little bit more about the methods of Deveikut. The first method of Deveikut, as we mentioned, these are through the commandments. The second method of Deveikut is through emotional arousal. And that emotional arousal can come about through, for example, prayer and citing psalms, like just saying the psalms, but saying them in a manner of Deveikut. In fact, there are several stories that are told about certain people who were very proficient in reciting psalms with the appropriate emotional engagement, and went into a state of very elevated Deveikut very quickly through doing that. Again, then there's intellectual Deveikut. In other words, you sit down and you study and you learn and you understand and you think through and you recall and you work on getting a clear picture of the way things are in some kind of mystical teaching, like exactly what the mystical teaching is trying to convey to you. And a person can be so kind of carried away that they won't hear or see or know what's going on around them at all for, it could be a very extended period of time. In other words, for hours and hours on end. And possibly even for days on end. So that's sort of intellectual Deveikut. And then ultimately, of course, we come to the highest level of Deveikut, the Deveikut of Keter, where one sort of sheds all methods and means, and it's just the cleaving of the essence of the soul to God. That is, that's essentially the Deveikut of the Rashbi, Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, and others. Baal Shem Tov was very proficient in this kind of Deveikut. In any event, that is the idea of Deveikut. So just to sort of summarize briefly. The first generations spoke about Kavanot, in other words, directing the energy to down the channels of the Sfirot, from the Sfirot, from one Sfirot to another via the various channels. The Arizal combined the Sfirot together and the names associated with Sfirot in order to elicit a higher level of light. The the Baal Shem Tov, focused much more on the concept of Deveikut, which is shedding all of these things and just focusing on the divinity within everything, and the divinity within oneself cleaves to the divine, to God, and one loses all sense of self, all sense of time, space, and so on and so forth. This can be done in various ways, through the mitzvot, through study, through emotional attachment to one sort or another, through love and awe and so on and so forth. And that essentially is the concept of Deveikut. Now, there are many texts that actually deal with these things. I'm thinking that perhaps. Well, when we learn Tanya, we will come across them and we'll discuss them at greater length. In the meanwhile, are there any questions? I see there are quite a few in the chat. Okay. Let's just see here. Yeah, that could be Yael, but it's not actually the act of kissing so much. It's more describing a certain arousal of love and how shall I say it? It's loss of the sense of self. Let's put it that way. That's really what it is. That's the concept of kissing. Yeah. Okay. When we would be in God consciousness, we would not be aware of this, since we cannot be in both domains. That is a good question, but that would really take place in that dimension over there, where you'd either be in one dimension or the other. Yechida is such a high level of God consciousness that it does not deny or does not negate the concept of a world. It does not deny or negate the concept of a world at all. In other words, the world is in fact seen to be part of God consciousness. In fact, the entire world is really God being conscious of the world. So that's its existence. So it would not be a contradiction. But it's a good question. Possible to go directly from Malchut to Chokhmah? Yes. Why? Why is it possible to go from Malchut to Chokhmah? Because there is a principle in the Zohar called Abba Yisad Brata. Abba is Chokhmah, is the foundation, is that which establishes Malchut. So in other words, action can go straight to Chokhmah. One has to learn the path. It's not necessarily that simple, but it is definitely a possibility, yes. The next question, while in the world of Asiya, is it possible to be connected to Atzilut? Okay, yes, it is. Let me just explain something. Where's that previous drawing here? 1 second. Okay. I just want to explain something that's quite important over here. When we say that there are 4 worlds, we're not counting the world of Adam Kadmon right now, but 4 imminent worlds: the world of Atzilut, Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya. So the way this actually works is that in the world of Atzilut itself, you have Atzilut of Atzilut, you have Bria of Atzilut, you have Yetzirah of Atzilut, and you have Asiya of Atzilut. Similarly, in Bria, you have Atzilut of Bria, Bria of Bria, Yetzirah of Bria, and Asiya of Bria, and so on with all of the worlds. That's the way it works. So, even in the world of Asiya, which is the lowest world, there is Atzilut of Asiya. In fact, there's even Adam Kadmon of Asiya, right? Even Adam Kadmon of Asiya. In other words, it's possible in the world of Asiya to connect to the highest level of Asiya, which is Adam Kadmon, and certainly Atzilut, and to get a glimpse of the real world, the full world of Atzilut, the way it is up at the top, so to speak, within that, within the world of Asiya. It is, what would you call it? Like a hologram, I suppose. I'm not sure if hologram is the right word, but let's put it this way. Just as you have chokhmah in the world of Asiyah, and that chokhmah in the world of Asiyah is related to chokhmah of Atzilut, where the primary sphira of the world of Atzilut is chokhmah, the primary sphira of the world of Asiyah is Malchut, a fractal, maybe that's what it is. Yeah, maybe that's a better word. Yeah. Right, I think it's a fractal, correct. So, in any event, just as you have Chokhmah of Asiyah, Chokhmah of Asiyah relates to Chokhmah of Atzilut because they're both Chokhmah. It's just a matter of degree. But the essence is the same. It's just a matter of degree of revelation. This happens to only be in Asiyah, it's only the Chokhmah of Asiyah. Whereas in Atzilut, it's the primary sphira of Atzilut, and therefore that is the nature of Atzilut, is the nature of Chokhmah. But nevertheless, even in the world of Asiyah, one can be in touch with, so to speak, Chokhmah of Atzilut. Okay. Let's go to the next question. Common denominator of the divine. I'm so thankful. Yeah, right. Exactly. Emunah is definitely the essence. Emunah is definitely the essence. Yes. Faith and faithfulness is definitely the essence. But we are, let's put it this way. The soul, before it was clothed in the body, had Emunah, right? There's actually a verse that says, Ani Emunah, I am Emunah, talking about us, human beings. We are faith, like that's who we really are. Down underneath it all, unless a person has caused their souls to be cut off from God by one means or another, one terrible action or another, for instance, murder and things like that, whatever. I certainly hope none of us are guilty of such things. But in any event, we are born with emunah, natural inborn emunah. Now, this inborn emunah that we have is the way we are even before we are born. When we are born, we're given all the other 10 sphirot, all the other sphirot as well, all of the other qualities, all of the other powers of the soul. And therefore, since we are brought into this world, it is not enough to remain with emunah, to remain with faith. It's not enough to remain with faith. We have to incorporate the faith into everything that we do, into every aspect of our being. The Baal Shem Tov was famous for this, that even in the most dire circumstances, he was completely, he faced everything with complete equanimity. Let me just draw something on the board for you here that'll explain this. Explain this quite nicely, I think. Let's clear all drawings. Okay. There's a concept called, this is what in Hebrew it would be written as follows. Shiviti. Oops. Let me just redo that. I was watching my board instead of watching the whiteboard. Okay. Shiviti. Shiviti, Hashem. Hashem is God. Name of God. Shiviti Hashem Lenegdi. I'm not going to write the whole verse out, but anyway. It finishes off with the word tamid, always. I'm just still learning to write with this pen. Okay, so Shiviti Hashem lenegdi tamid, and that was, what does that mean? It means I place God always before me. That's the way it's always translated, right? I always place God before me. In other words, in whatever situation I am, I can put my mind to focus on godliness. All right? But the Baal Shem Tov explained that this word shiviti is related to the word, ishtavut. Ishtavut. Ishtavut is equanimity. Equanimity means just being completely calm and relaxed about everything. Why? Because I'm in God's hands. I'm just completely relaxed. Yeah, sure, yeah. Just be in touch with me, preferably by email. So in other words, this concept of hishtavut, of equanimity, is because how can a person be in a state of equanimity all the time? There's so many things in the world that worry us, and there's so many things in the world that seem to be dreadful, dire, terrible circumstances. And the answer is because the person focuses on this idea here, Shivisi Hashem Negdi Tomid. I always place God before me. In other words, I always have God in front of me, so to speak. The Negdi means in front of me, opposite me, in my mind. God is always there in my mind, and therefore, you would people who knew the Baal Shem Tov would say that he will always like having conversations, so to speak, with having conversations with God all the time, like as you would talk to a friend, except that it was this constant. In the case of the Baal Shem Tov, a dialogue. It wasn't just a one-way conversation. It was kind of a dialogue. And the same thing is true of Moses, right? Moshe Rabbeinu. It's a dialogue. It's not just a one-way conversation. So that is the idea of when one has the proper emunah, when you have the proper faith and faithfulness, then the idea of the equanimity of soul starts to take over, because I'm not in control here. Hishtavut, equanimity, means giving up control. It doesn't matter if this happens or that happens. Although I would, ostensibly on the surface of it, prefer this outcome, but God knows what's better, and therefore that outcome is also fine. Whatever He decides, that's the way it's going to be. It's fine. Like I don't have to worry about it because He's looking out for my best interests. Not my best interests that I think are my best interests, but the best interests that He thinks are the best interests. I'll give you an example of this, a story that I actually read recently. I mentioned recently that that book called My Story of meetings of people with the Lubavitcher Rebbe. So there's one particular story over there of an Israeli general who happened to just be in New York at the time, and he decided he would like to speak to the Lubavitcher Rebbe about something, whatever. Anyway, he was in a meeting. It was a meeting of several different people over there, and he was asking. He asked all kinds of questions. One of the questions he asked, actually, that was later in a private meeting. In a private meeting, he later asked. He asked the Rebbe why it is that he does not go and live in the land of Israel. Why he does not go and live in Israel. And the Rebbe stopped for a moment. And he said because he would not be able to have the same influence on affairs as he can when he's in America, because with governments and so on and so forth. Anyway, that was one answer, but here's the answer that I want you to understand in terms of hishtavut, of equanimity. This person asked. He had a very, very good friend. He was a general, and he was an Air Force pilot. He'd flown all kinds of planes, from Spitfires, Falcons, F-15s and so on and so forth. He was a very accomplished pilot who had flown most of the Mirages and so on and so forth. And he had a very, very good friend, his best friend, who was killed in, his plane was shot down. And then his son-in-law was also killed in combat. That man's son-in-law, the pilot that was killed, his son-in-law was killed in combat. And then his daughter passed away from a terrible illness. So this friend said, he asked the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and he said to him, this is the whole, how could it possibly be? How could you believe in a compassionate God when all these things are piled up on one person? And the Rebbe was silent for a very long time, like a few minutes. And the captain said, the general rather said that he could see that he was very upset by the question. But he said to him very, very quietly, he said, when you don't see the whole picture, then you can question, you question perhaps the righteousness of a certain action, of something, of an event. That's when you don't see the whole picture. But if you do see the whole picture, then you understand that that's the way it had to be. That's what's called hishtavut. Now, it demands a tremendous amount of work, tremendous amount of effort to get to that kind of equanimity, that whatever happens, it's okay. I'll be all right. And if I'm not all right, even if a person loses their life in the process, that's also okay, because that's, I'm not directing affairs. There's someone else doing it. Okay, so that's the concept of hishtavut, and that's the concept of emunah. It's very closely related to the concept of emunah, and that's the highest level of Deveikut, essentially. All right. Further questions. So lowly asi is not that lowly after all. No, it's not. It's possible to reach the highest levels from the lowest world, indeed. And we can discuss that, yes. I talk to God all the time. Oh, Rabbi, how come his words cannot describe? Not a major surgery, no need for post-surgical surgical narcotics. One of many. Oh, there you go. I'm glad to hear that you're using your studies and your knowledge in a practical way. That is a wonderful thing. And we should all learn a lesson from you, and we should all do the same thing. Good. Okay. Any more questions, folks, or are we good? All right. Next week, I'm not really sure. I'll let you know.